It's really hard not to spoil something when talking about it, whether reviewing or recommending. And I've kind of been an ass about it recently, so my apologies. I've actually been an ass about this for a while. So, spoiler warning, duh. So, Chainsaw Man Part 2, one of the main discussions surrounding it, given the title and the thumbnail, whatever it's going to be, I don't know yet, is how slow it's sort of been, the pacing of Chainsaw Man Part 2. And that's been a big thing regarding the conversation, given that it's been going on for a year and has 39 chapters, if I'm not mistaken. And that's like the main thing I hear, the pacing, complaints about that. And there's a few things I'd like to give my perspective on regarding that. The first thing is Chainsaw Man Part 1 was neck-breaking speeds at certain points. It's like the meme that Chainsaw Man's pacing was absolutely absurd, but I think part of that isn't entirely true. It is, but let me get what I mean. I think when most people got into Chainsaw Man, by that point, when the manga was really getting exposure, this was back when I covered it for the first time, it was around Rize. It was around the Bomb Devil arc, if not slightly after. And it's around that point in the story from that moment forward where the story really does kick into a whole different gear. That's not to say that the first 40 chapters didn't have a lot of things going on. They did. But I think the perception of Chainsaw Man's incredibly fast pacing and crazy climax happening after crazy climax is due to the fact that I think the large majority of readers got into binging the series by the time those chapters were coming out. And it's very different going from a week-to-week experience when you're reading the build-up chapters versus going in the week-to-week experience when you're getting the payoff chapters, which was the second half of Chainsaw Man. And so I think that could possibly be it, as I myself, I've allowed these chapters to stack up. I don't keep up on most of the stuff that I read week to week. I usually let the chapters build up and then read it through, because I think taking a chapter out of its surrounding context can really take a lot of the sting out of it, and I'm not trying to do that. But I can still understand the sentiments of the weekly readers for Part 2, given the fact that with what's going on within the story, at least within the dynamic between Denji and Asa, it feels like we're taking 2 steps forward, 1 step back. There's always something in the way, always something preventing it, but I think that's necessary to really allow time for this dynamic to build up in a healthy sense. Denji was given all of Part 1 to develop as a character, and in Part 2, he still really is developing as a character, but the large majority of, I think, the necessity for character focus is going to be Asa, given that she's the one presented to us, and I think the fact that it's taking its time, and I've spoken about this before, is a really good thing, because it's a dynamic that I really do appreciate, in the sense that you have Asa, who can be this incredibly melodramatic character who goes into this really heavy themes at times of isolation and sometimes even suicide with that, and the fear of being both in solitude and with companionship given how people have mistreated her. And then you take that and contrast it with Denji, who is just purely absurd at certain points within the story. We've seen how he's matured, we've seen how he's grown, we see his desires as a character, but if there was a way I could kind of define Chainsaw Man Part 2, it's a lot of emotion behind a lot of absurdity. And it creates for a really enjoyable read, in my opinion, when reading it all the way through. Although, again, I can imagine how it is for the week-to-week experience, where it does sort of feel like we've progressed and then we take a step back. We've progressed and we take a step back, along with all of the different questions we still have as to where the story is going, what's going to be the major threat, or has the major threat already presented itself into the story, like with Part 1, where originally, I think I said something along the, like, if you go back and watch my very first video on Chainsaw Man, I'm like, well, here are my thoughts on Makima and this and that, but I don't think we have the great antagonist within the story yet. That statement aged horribly. And due to the nature and the condition in which Asa is as a character within the context of the story, with her and the War Devil, and with Denji and what he's going to continue to progress as a character, and then having to put these two together, is I think simply going to take more time than what we had in Part 1. And I'm perfectly okay with that. I think the only legitimate comparison off the top of my head I could give is how JoJo's, with each part, the first half of each part tends to be very slow at times, depending on which part you're talking about more than others. And then once it hits the middle point onwards, then it's just all the payoffs that we've been wanting. And I think that's going to be what happens with part 2. Personally, I think the longer you allow this sort of dynamic between Asa and Denji to grow, the more that you get the readers emotionally invested. So if Fujimoto pulls some tragically horrible shit again, like his track record has proven to show, well, then it's going to be absolutely soul-destroying. But I don't know if that's the direction he's going to want to take for this part. And I think a lot of people just forget the setup part 1 really had for its first 40 chapters, where there were a lot of slice-of-life sort of moments, especially between the dynamic of Denji and Makima. And there are certain moments in part 2 where I do scratch my head a little, because as I said, Asa's this incredibly sentimental character. We get a lot into her mind, and some of the dialogue might feel on the nose, but I think it's appropriate given the fact that she is sort of talking to herself, and this isn't stuff that she's outwardly saying to other people most of the time. And then we have Denji, who's just incredibly absurd. Like, don't get me wrong, Denji has matured, and there's moments, especially in the recent chapters, where he's shown his maturity, but he's still Denji. And I think on its own, I think those moments where Denji is just being himself might make the chapters feel pointless at the end of it. But I think his sort of comedic timing helps alleviate how heavy of a character Asa can be, especially during the Falling Devil sort of portion of the story where she's going on about how life isn't worth living. And Denji is, well, to put it in PG terms, somebody who enjoys the simple things in life. And if there is one complaint I could possibly have for part 2 is, in comparison to part 1, there isn't really anything outside of the mystery of the supporting characters in this part that keeps me invested or interested, other than where could these characters possibly go and what piece of the puzzle they're going to play in the grander scheme of things regarding famine, regarding Nayuta, regarding Yoshida. I don't really, there's nothing really about them that sort of has me compelled, because the story hasn't really presented them in that sort of way. They feel more so like external forces that pop up here and there whenever necessary for the story, instead of characters that I'm really invested in. And I think that's something part 1 had within its earlier segment, with the introduction of characters like Power and Aki. I don't think that exists yet within this story. And again, I think that's largely due to the fact that the focus is a lot more on Asa and her dynamic and how she's going to grow as a character in the midst of everything. Maybe it's for the better, because if Fujimoto were to have to then focus on supporting characters and building them up properly in regards to how they're going to develop throughout the story, then the pacing would probably come to a standing halt. So it's probably just a byproduct of choosing to focus so heavily on a character like Asa, who, in my opinion, is already one of the best characters Chainsaw Man has, including part 1 and 2. Really do love everything going on with her character. And so I can't complain with what the story has chosen to focus on. And I would much rather a story take its time, and therefore when we enter the latter half of the story, everything feels natural and there isn't things that feel like they came out of nowhere, therefore breaking our immersion as readers. I would much rather a story that just took its time during its build-up phase, therefore when the later stuff happens, the payoff is worth it. And I hope that's the case for Chainsaw Man Part 2.